coming up.
Means you cannot vote for your own companies to receive money from the board you're on. It's against the act. You, sir, were responsible for being the eyes and ears of the deputy in that meeting. And I just don't believe that you never told them that these things were going on.
It was said at the beginning of the meeting. So what are you talking about that you had no independent way of assessing? You're just making it up.
They declared it.
You're making it up to cover your butt.
Conflicts of interest or perceived conflicts of interest have to be reported to the Minister of Industry. So you're aware of these conflicts. You were there to administer the oversight of the contribution agreements. Did you report these conflicts as you were required to in the contribution agreement, Article 20.03? Did you report these to the Minister?
So you will appreciate this analogy. There appears to have been a Roadrunner Acme anvil dropped on the Coyote on every bloody meeting in this, and you seem to have missed it.
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
Pursuant to Standing Order 1083G, the committee is continuing its study on Report 6, Sustainable Development Technology Canada, 2024 report of the Auditor General.
Yesterday I had a minor accident and injured my face and lips, sometimes making it such that my voice is less clear and raspy, so I apologize for any inconvenience this creates for the committee, and please let me know if you wish me to repeat anything.
Mr. Perkins, you'll lead us off, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Noseworthy. Mr. Noseworthy, when you were Assistant Deputy Minister at the Industry Department, you served as an observer on the board at SDTC for 6 years, I understand it, until I believe you retired in 2023. Is that correct?
Sir, first I take issue with the word observer, which I believe implies a greater responsibility than I had. I was there at their invitation to offer information and nothing further. I withdrew from the board before I retired when we first became aware of the whistleblowers' allegations.
So,
I believe that was
so you were there at the board's invitation. So your boss at the time, for most of that time, former Deputy Minister Newbley of the Industry Department, said he insisted that you be at the meetings as his eyes and ears. So are you incorrect in your assumption, or is he incorrect in what he told the committee?
Sir, I'm not sure these things are mutually exclusive. If you take a look at the board minutes, they clearly indicate I'm there at the invitation of the board.
I will take it that
Mr.
your immediate boss, the Deputy Minister, had the correct framing of what your role was, to be his eyes and ears, because he said not all deputy ministers agreed with that approach with agencies and boards, but he insisted on that in the ones that I said. So, since you were there to be his eyes and ears on what was going on, you must have had regular meetings with him about what was going on.
Mr. Chair, I spoke regularly to both Deputy Minister Newbley and Deputy Minister Kennedy when I was in my position. We carried discussion over a wide range of issues. SDCC would certainly come up when there was a matter of specific concern. With respect to Mr. Newbley, our key concerns were around the issues related to the implementation of the management action plan that came out of the evaluation of that organization in either 2017 or 2018, how to better see the organization integrate into policy on the federal side.
And then being the eyes and ears of your deputy minister in the Liberal Green Slush Fund, did you ever read the SDTC Act?
Yes, of course, sir, I did.
So then you with the clause on page 9 of the Act on directors not to profit. It says, except as provided under subsection 1, no director shall profit or gain any income or acquire any property from the foundation or its activities. Yet we know that the Auditor General has found that 9 directors, for a total of 82% of the transactions, were conflicted when money was voted to companies they had, representing $330 million in that alone. And then, of course, there's the $59 million that the Auditor General found that they voted for companies, some of which were their own, totally outside the contribution agreements which you referenced. So I would like to know, since you read the act and since you saw them voting for each other's companies, did you ever raise that with the Deputy Minister?
Sir, what I saw in front of me at STTC was a regularly functioning board where people recused themselves where they thought there was a real reason to.
So I'll read it again because I don't see anywhere in the Act where it says it's okay to vote yourself property or investments if you recuse yourself. So let me read it again. Except as provided under subsection 1, no director shall profit or gain any income or acquire any property from the foundation or its activities. When tens of millions of dollars were going to directors' funds, Andre-Lise Matteau, who you watched, vote $10.7 million by her own admission, and I'm not sure what was a level of conflict that would worry you, but $10.7 million to her own companies. The number's actually higher. When you saw Steve Kuchar, when you saw Gary Ouimet vote money for their own companies and have fellow directors vote them, total of $300 million, and you were sitting there 82% of the time. They began each meeting by outlining which director and which project was conflicted. You know, my friend here, his project's up, so he's conflicted, and my director here, so he'll just get out and recuse himself. And you sat in those meetings 82% of the time when things were happening, and you never reported that to your boss?
Sir, I had no way of independently assessing conflicts of interest by the board, specifically with the interpretation that you are applying to the Act. I am not a lawyer.
Interpretation, I'll do it again, except as provided under subsection 1. That's not very complicated. No director shall profit or gain any income or acquire any property. That's not tough. You don't have to be a lawyer. Even a bureaucrat could figure out that that means you cannot vote for your own companies to receive money from the board you're on. It's against the Act. You, sir, were responsible for being the eyes and ears of the deputy in that meeting. And I just don't believe that you never told them that these things were going on. Like, who are you covering up for?
Mr. Chair, I had very limited information upon which to look at issues of conflict of interest.
Said this director has a conflict, and then that director gets the money, and then the next director gets the money, and you're sitting in the meeting. What? That's not information to report back?
I had no way to independently assess, Mr. Chair. I had no way to independently assess, Mr. Chair, what holdings individual board members had or who in fact...
And voted themselves. It didn't need to be independent. It was right before you.
Thank
Were
you.
you even listening?
Thank you, Mr. Perkins.
Many colleagues here blame you and the department for sitting idly and failing to flag and act in the face of STTC failure to abide by their own conflict of interest policies, jeopardizing an entire foundation and taxpayer funding in the process. How do you respond to this criticism?
Mr. Chair, I take that criticism seriously, but I would like the committee to understand the capacity that I had personally to assess those matters. I saw a package of materials, usually 2 days before a meeting of the board, that contained information on projects. I attended the board meetings, and other than that material, I had no way of independently assessing whether there were potential conflicts. Most importantly, I recognize it was the fiduciary responsibility of the board members there to act in accordance with their own rights and responsibilities, and also had an expectation that STTC would provide sufficient monitoring of that process and raise concerns with me if they felt there was a failure in that system. And no one from STTC ever raised a concern about conflict of interest with me, other than the specific concern the committee is aware about with Ms. Verschuren's chairmanship.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Noseworthy, you were ISED's eyes and ears at the SDTC board, attending each and every board meeting in which there were 186 conflicts of interest involving board members. The Auditor General identified 90 instances in which the conflict of interest policy was not complied with. There were multiple real conflicts of interest, including tens of millions of dollars that were funneled from SDTC to companies in which board members had interests, and your excuse for supposedly saying nothing, doing nothing, and reporting nothing back is that you had no independent way of assessing conflicts of interest. Really? How can you assert that when the evidence was right in front of you?
The fiduciary responsibility on conflict of interest rests with the member of the board. It is the responsibility of the
Mr.
organization
Noseworthy,
to ensure-
you made the statement that you had no independent way of assessing conflicts of interest, and I put it to you that that is false. The evidence was right in front of you, wasn't it? Because, Mr. Noseworthy, this committee has heard plenty of evidence about the fact that weeks before each board meeting, an agenda was sent out. Board members were invited to identify which projects they had conflicts of interest in, and at the beginning of the meeting, the secretary would read out which projects involving which directors conflicts of interest existed. So again, the evidence was right in front of you. And you said nothing, you did nothing, you covered it up. Is that what you're saying?
Mr. Chair, I only saw the materials that were circulated for.
Yeah, and the materials provided, certain members had conflicts of interest. And it was said at the beginning of the meeting. So what are you talking about that you had no independent way of assessing? You're just making it up.
They declared it.
You're making it up to cover your butt.
Mr. Chair, when people declared conflict of interest and it was raised at the beginning of the meeting, my experience was that they recused themselves and they were not part of the discussion on the project.
So they left the room. Did they leave the room? Because recusing oneself is not sufficient, but even if they did leave the room, that's not acceptable either, is it? Because Section 12 of the SDTC Act states very clearly that no director shall profit or gain any income or acquire any property from the foundation or its activities. One such board member, the good friend of the Environment Minister, Andre Lise-Matteau, admitted before this committee that $10.4 million was funneled from SDTC into companies that she had interests in. That is a complete violation of the SDTC Act. Yes, she declared the conflict. Yes, she left the room. You were at each of those meetings. Why didn't you report these blatant violations of the SDTC Act? You were aware of the Act. You admitted you were aware of the Act. Why didn't you report $10.4 million funneled into her companies improperly and illegally?
Mr. Chair, my experience again, sorry, there seems to have been some feedback. Mr. Chair, my experience was that people recused themselves, and my assumption was by recusing themselves and following normal board procedures, they would have been in compliance with the
What part of Section 12.2, no director shall profit or gain any income or acquire any property, do you not understand?
I am not a lawyer, sir, and Mr. Chair, I believe that clause needs to be read in reflection on what the
$10.4 million going into companies that Andre Lise-Matteau had interest in.
Mr. Cooper, just I have a point of order. Yes, Ms. Khalid.
Chair, we've spent a lot of months and years trying to make sure that our interpreters are well taken care of. We don't need to yell that loudly when we're talking into a microphone, because I do believe that it is hurting their ears. So, Chair, if you can, if you can please.
Thank you. All right, I was hearing Miss Khalid. It's all right, Mr. Durain. I appreciate your concern. It's one I share. Mr. Cooper, you have about 40 seconds left, and I would urge you just to be aware of the interpreters. I see where you're going, and I know that committee members share your concerns, but if you could just keep that in mind, you have 40 seconds, please.
Well, Mr. Noseworthy, what were you doing at each of these meetings? Eating chicken fingers? I mean, what were you doing?
Mr. Chair, as I've now indicated multiple times, I saw my role there as around policy coordination and providing board members with advice that they might find useful in policy coordination and ultimately making decisions around the organization.
Thank you very much. Up next, Ms. Yip.
I really do want to hear very clearly, how did you see your role on the SDTC board?
I truly saw my role as a liaison. Sorry, there seems to be feedback on the microphones.
There's Chair. Are you able to hear?
I'll speak again.
Okay.
I believe I'm getting feedback from in the room. I'll speak again.
Are you hearing it in your earpiece, Mr. Noseworthy?
Yes, I'm afraid. Yes.
Okay. I'll have the clerk look into that. In the meantime, you may proceed.
As I've indicated, Mr. Chair, I saw my role around policy coordination and acting as a liaison with the organization to ensure it was aware of what was happening with other federal policies and programs. I only participated in a substantive way in the first part of the meeting, which was sort of a policy update, where I provided that type of information. I was keen to see what the organization was doing on its own accord in collecting information on what was going on in the industry, and we did feed that back both to the Deputy Minister and also in our own work and understanding what the needs and requirements of the sector would be. I did not see my role in participating in board meetings as having any specific or formal role around oversight of administrative matters. And when it specifically came to the issue of conflict of interest, I saw myself as having no particular role unless I was called upon by SDTC or by a board member and became aware of a specific conflict issue, and that never occurred.
I find it troubling that you were there at the meetings and you saw these conflicts and yet you did not act.
Mr. Chair, if I can, these conflicts were not evident in these meetings. It was clearly obvious that people recused themselves at the beginning of the meeting announced their recusal at the beginning of the meeting and then left. I did not see any situation, and I would have acted upon it if I had seen a situation where a board member had intentionally violated their obligations on conflict of interest and sat there to discuss a project that I knew they had a stake in.
Up next is Mr. McCauley for 5 minutes, please.
Thanks, Chair. Mr. Noseworthy, how long did you work with Mr. Nobley when he was Deputy Minister?
I began work with Mr. Nubley in 2016.
Just a simple answer, please. How many years, please?
Yeah, I'm just trying to work it out in my head, sir. My apologies. I believe about 5 years. 4 or 5 years.
So let me ask you, he stated that you met often and that he was your eyes and ears on the board. Did you bring up the issue of the conflicts with him at all? You obviously worked together a long time. You met many times together. The whole public service operates under the basic and the guiding principle of risk aversion and CYA, and you know what the A stands for, basically cover your backside. So did you bring this up, these conflict issues, with the Deputy Minister?
Mr. Chair, if conflict issues had become apparent to me or were made apparent to me by STTC, I would have immediately raised them with the Deputy Minister.
So you didn't raise anything. Now, I'm going to ask, we had Ms. Colbeck, who's the Vice President, with us on Monday. She, like you, like Mr. Norbley and everyone else, seems to been completely, like Tommy, rock opera, blind, deaf, and dumb to the conflicts of interest. Stating, accepting no accountability or responsibility, but she did state that conflicts were minuted from the board meetings that you were at. And yet you seem to be saying that there were no conflicts that you were aware of. Could you explain that to us, please?
My understanding is that when a conflict...
Your understanding, I'm asking a simple question. The Vice President, Ms. Colbeck, stated the conflicts were minuted at the meeting you were at. You were at all the meetings. She stated the conflicts were minuted. So you were at this meeting, so conflicts were discussed. What did you do with those conflicts?
When I became aware of the conflicts that were minuted and they were dealt with in due process, I saw no need to bring them further. It was a matter within the purview of the organization and its conflict of interest.
You talked about your role being ensuring the administration of the contribution agreement. Article 20.03 of the contribution agreement states very clearly that conflicts of interest or perceived conflicts of interest have to be reported to the Minister of Industry. So you're aware of these conflicts. You were there to administer the oversight of the contribution agreements. Did you report these conflicts, as you were required to in the contribution agreement, Article 20.03, did you report these to the Minister?
Mr. Chair, my understanding of the...
Not asking your understanding. I'm asking, did you do your job? You stated you were there for the administration of the contribution agreement. The contribution agreement states very clearly conflicts of interest have to be reported to the Minister. Did you...
By the organization, sir. By the organization.
Right, so you thought, oh, it's someone else's job. Even though you stated you were there to ensure the administration of the contribution agreement. But that's not your job. You knew about the conflict, but it's not your job.
I saw my responsibility as I have stated here. I had seen any deviation from conflict of interest obligations, as I've indicated, I would have reported them. I saw it as the obligation on the organization to report to the Minister because that's what the contribution agreement says.
It's his job to do it. $400 million, the taxpayers' money, but it's someone else's job to do it, and you were aware of it, but it's someone else's job. We had I mentioned before to Ms. Colbeck, we had a low-level or lower-level person in the public service brave enough to be a whistleblower and come forward to you as well. But you didn't have that bravery, and you didn't see it as your job for oversight, even though you stated earlier today that part of your role was to ensure the administration of the contribution agreement. But I guess not necessarily.
Mr. Chair, the whistleblower never came to me. I'm not aware of the work of the whistleblower, and I never spoke to that person.
I think it was your role as an ADM who does have fiduciary duties under the Financial Administration Act to act on this. You just thought it was someone else's job. Like, who should have done that then?
As I've indicated, I saw the responsibility on reporting conflicts.
Mr. McCauley, you're out of time, but why don't that's a pertinent question. Whose job was it? Why don't you answer that, Mr. Noseworthy, and then we'll move on.
Yes, as I was saying, that I saw that as an obligation of the organization to report to the Minister consistent with the terms of the contribution agreement.
Thank you very much. Up next is Mr. Erskine Smith joining us virtually. You have the floor, sir, for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much. Mr. Noseworthy, you've read the Auditor General's report?
Yes.
And do you disagree with anything in that report?
No, I do not. I actually think it's a well-prepared report, and I support its recommendations.
What am I to make then? I mean, your last exchange with Mr. McCauley, for example, in the role that you saw yourself occupying, that report, and I'll read from findings 6.77, we found that ISED had not received records of conflict of interest at SDTC other than those documented in the materials and meeting minutes of the Board of Directors. Since 2018, the contribution agreements require the Foundation to report without delay to the Department about conflicts of interest. We found that the Department had not asked for or received such information and did not determine what actions it should take when informed of conflicts of interest by the Foundation. Goes on to say at 6.78, as described in paragraph 6.52, we found several situations that may have involved conflicts of interest that the Foundation did not report to the Department over the audit period. And finally, at 6.79, ISED should ensure that it assesses challenges and monitors conflict of interest at SDTC. So if that wasn't your role, but you agree with the report's conclusions, I mean, whose role did you see it to be?
I accept that the department should have done more in that space, sir. I believe that there is considerably more that the department could have done in its oversight of the organization.
Aren't you the department, though?
Limited resources.
I mean, like with respect, like, aren't you the department?
We did what we could with the resources we had.
No, but I mean, in this particular case, you're the individual who attends these committee meetings, the board meetings, I should say. The conflicts, I mean, if not your role, whose possible role at the department would it be?
I believe it's a joint responsibility that I would have shared with the vice president responsible for administration and finance of the department, but I'm not sure on that. I accept the fact that we could have done more to report on conflicts of interest, but again, I saw their specific responsibility in that space. Under the contribution agreement is the organization reporting to us.
Do you think when you look in, after the fact, you've got the benefit of the Auditor General's report, which you agree with, do you think that how you saw your role was, in retrospect, incorrect?
I think the Auditor General's report actually speaks specifically to my role and the fact that there were two distinctly different views of what that role would be. And I believe that in the future, if there is to be a person playing the type of role that I played on whatever future organization or board exists to replace STTC, that the specific roles and responsibilities of that person need to be very clearly specified.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Noseworthy, you're clearly of a similar age as me, so you will appreciate this analogy. There appears to have been a Roadrunner Acme anvil dropped on the Coyote on every bloody meeting in this, and you seem to have missed it. I don't quite get it, and on terms of conflicts of interest. But I'm gonna ask you. I have spoken to a number of the past board chairs, and and I've had some interesting conversations, and one of them shared with me as an interesting story, and I'd like to ask you this question based on that conversation. Did you ever ask a sitting chair of SDTC for a job?
No.
That's not what this chair said to me. I will move on then, because you're aware that doing so would be a breach of the ethics code of the public service.
I certainly did not.
Okay, I'm going to move on. Let's get back to this issue of former SDTC CEO's testimony on this and on the appointment of Ms. Verschuren. And she testified before Parliament and said that it was you that informed her that Ms. Verschuren would be appointed and would replace Mr. Bulsilli.
Yes, I was asked by the Deputy Minister's office to call her and inform her that an order in council had been cut appointing Ms. Verschuren to the position.
I think this was before that, because she expressed her concern, according to her testimony, to you about the conflict of interest, and it took several weeks to get back to her, where she testified that then again you confirmed that in spite of the conflicts, she was going to be appointed.
I recall two conversations with the former CEO on Ms. Verschuren and her conflict. The first was when she informed me that Ms. Verschuren was a candidate and that she had informed Ms. Verschuren that she should seek the advice of the Conflicts and Ethics Commissioner. And the second was the conversation I just described.
And you mentioned the deputy's office told you to say this. We couldn't quite get that out of either of the two deputies. Who in the deputy's office told you to tell Ms. Lawrence this?
I don't recall. It's a common practice to inform the CEO
deputy
of that type of a decision. I suspect that was at the time that Mr. Nubley was in the process of retiring. I suspect it was someone within his office, perhaps the corporate secretary or someone else. I don't recall the specifics.
Could you, who would that have been, the corporate for Mr. Nubley?
I can't recall the name, sir, but I'm sure the department can provide it.
Okay, we will follow that up. So, did you say to her that the conflicts will be managed?
I don't recall ever using that term in a discussion with Ms. Lawrence. When I advised her, as she's reported, that Ms. Verschuren was to be appointed, or had been appointed, she expressed concern about the conflicts. I'm sure we talked at that time about the importance of the organization having solid conflict of interest.
So were you aware that Mr. Emet had applied or been considered and was rejected before Ms. Verschuren was the president?
No.
Or was the chair, I should say? You don't? But you do recall him being appointed after Ms. Verschuren, because Ms. Lawrence testified that he was rejected because of his conflicts, and then after Ms. Verschuren was appointed where managed conflicts would be in, she testified that he was then put back on the list to be a director now that conflicts were okay.
I have no knowledge of that.
You have no knowledge of that. Another Acme sort of squashing thing happening here. You remember quite a lot of details about your expertise or thoughts about how good this organization was, but you don't seem to remember any of the meetings that you attended when it came to conflicts of interest, when everybody was having to leave that meeting. Every meeting, at least several, were having to leave and recuse themselves. There must have been a lot of wind blowing by as they went out the door before their colleagues voted them more money. And then you never said anything. Like, it's incredulous to believe this, that you would sit there and say nothing to anyone about this. Now, I'll ask you once again, or ask you, do you regret now never having raised these issues of conflicts of interest with your direct supervisor? And by the way, did you get a bonus every one of those years you were on this board?
Mr. Chair, I could only speak to my deputy minister about what I saw in front of me. The conflicts of interest, which have since come to light with the organization, were not obvious to me. They were not presented in a way that caused me sufficient concern.
And the second part of my question?
I think I received compensation, which includes an annual performance bonus that is similar to every other ADM in the federal system.
Thank you very much.
Why are you here today? Can you help us understand why you think you're here today?
Mr. Chair, I'm here to assist the committee in whatever way I can to understand what happened. I am myself, as a student of this, looking to see what happened here. I can say to the committee with absolute confidence that I did not see issues of conflict of interest based on the vantage point I had in that organization. I accept at face value the determinations that have since come forward by the Auditor General in particular. And I think that as a matter of public policy, what happened here is something that requires interesting reflection in terms of the future governance and structure of federal organizations. And I would like to try and support the committee as it works through those issues.
Thanks so much. So you spoke about your vantage point and your involvement with SDTC with respect to the issue that we're discussing today. Now, can you tell me whether you are in a position to have access to the information about conflicts of interest or not, and whether you did have access and whether you had acted on it or not?
I certainly did not have access to that information. I suspect if I had gone in some sort of forensic way looking for it, I possibly could have received it. I did not see that as my role. I saw the responsibility on conflict of interest, as is the case with every board, a fiduciary responsibility on individuals, and a responsibility on the organization to have good practices. And I expected, at the end of the day, the organization to bring issues to my attention if there were problems, and that did not occur. If it had occurred, I absolutely would have gone looking.
Do you find that you have failed, I said, in the role that you've played with this whole debacle as we've been experiencing over the past number of months and years on this?
I certainly look at the situation that's in front of us with regret. I believe that I and my staff did what we could with the resources we had at the time. I believe that there is a fundamental issue here around the governance of organizations like independent foundations and how governments need to balance the issue of independence and oversight. And I believe that there are important lessons to learn in that space.
Have you made any money being in the role that you are in from the organizations that have interacted with STTC?
No, none whatsoever.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Noseworthy, the Auditor General in her report noted that with respect to the $38.5 million in so-called COVID relief payments, that ISID supported STDC's decision to funnel those monies out the door. Is that correct?
We accepted the decision of the organization to provide those funding, or that funding, yes.
And notwithstanding that those monies did not comply with the contribution agreement, correct?
The advice that we were working under is that as those projects were extensions of existing projects that had been previously approved, that they were in compliance with the contribution agreement.
And the minister's office was informed. The minister was informed of those payments, correct? You stated that STTC wrote to the minister.
That is correct.
Okay. Thank you for that. I will now be moving a motion